Hello and welcome to week 3 of AEE 5204. Today we're going to be delving into paradigms, theories, branches, and philosophical assumptions of evaluation, which, as you've probably seen from the readings, is some complex material. So today we'll just have this brief PowerPoint presentation to talk through some of these concepts, and hopefully that will help you understand the readings a little bit better. And then as we jump into the forum discussion and the activity for this week, hopefully everything will be able to be tied together, and most importantly, you'll be able to tie some of these concepts in with your daily realities in your professional practice. But before we really jump into the paradigms and branches and theories, the readings over the last couple of weeks, last week and this week, have captured some key terms and ideas that I want to be sure that we just get out in the open very clearly. Many of you have been using these terms and even reflecting on them in the activities and the forum prompts that you've written. But I just for everyone's benefit, I want to be sure that we've got a list of these key terms that are really foundational as we move forward and start talking about the different theories of evaluation, and then eventually, in a couple of weeks, the how-to actually walk through the various steps that go into a high-quality evaluation. So one that I'm sure you've seen is this distinction between formative and summative evaluation. Now, just in case you're still unclear on the definition, essentially formative evaluation is what is done while a program is still being run. So, as Trosham laid out, there's all sorts of different types of formative evaluations, but the essential purpose of a formative evaluation is to improve and inform, to form, really, the program as it's developed and as it's being offered. Summative evaluation comes once the program or project is already completed, and it allows the evaluator and the program implementers to make some sort of judgment about the merit, worth, or significance of that program. Similarly, there's this important distinction between process evaluation and outcome evaluation. And in a sense, this maps well onto the distinction between formative and summative evaluation, but it's not exactly a one-to-one relationship. So essentially, process evaluation focuses on the processes of a program, how things are being implemented. This might be some of the basic satisfaction type of variables that we often gather data on. Basically, is the program being implemented well? Is it being implemented as we hoped it would be? And then outcome evaluation is just that. It looks at outcomes, which again often we forget to look at, but things like the changes in knowledge, skills, behaviors, attitudes, societal conditions that generally come about after a program, but also could start accruing during a program as well. Now, the readings this week touch on this important distinction, which maybe we haven't made as clearly before, and that is the distinction between monitoring and evaluation. Now, this is much more important in international evaluation, international development evaluation, if you will. And I know many of us are focused primarily on evaluation here in Virginia or in the United States, so we probably won't come across this term monitoring that much, but I think it's important to know about. And so the definition is in the textbook, but just to round that out a little bit, monitoring in brief is the sort of constant checking of specific indicators while a program is going on. So maybe you might have some goals set out for what the program is going to achieve, but you know that you have to have a certain number of participants every month and maybe try to reach a certain demographic target every month. Well, then the monitoring might be involved in just doing some rapid inquiry to check on those numbers. These days, actually, a lot of evaluators in international development are trying to make monitoring be a little bit more complex than that, to have it be more connected to the learning purposes of evaluation. But there is still that distinction where monitoring is more kind of like formative evaluation in that it is occurring throughout the implementation of a program. And then in international terms, evaluation would be synonymous with what we call summative evaluation, something that is probably more robust, takes more resources, and does occur once the program is completed. This is another term that's come up in the readings over the last couple of weeks, and I just wanted to be sure that we were all on the same page about this. Meta-evaluation essentially means an evaluation of an evaluation. So I know it can start to sort of feel like a hall of mirrors, but however, if we think back to the competencies, meta-evaluation becomes important because we know that there are high-quality evaluations and low-quality evaluations. There might be competent evaluators and incompetent evaluators. So a meta-evaluation uses the same systematic inquiry that we are now coming to understand as evaluation and applies it either on itself, and then of course you would have issues of bias and whatnot. Or, for instance, an evaluation team could hire an external evaluator to conduct a meta-evaluation of themselves to say, did we do sampling well? Did we use the correct instruments or data collection tools? Did we engage with stakeholders well? Are we meeting the value-based criteria of our funder or of our stakeholders? What have you, depending on, of course, the different criteria of quality. Now, this is another kind of jargony term. Evaluend, as you may have seen in the readers, just refers to the thing being evaluated. So generally, in this class, we're talking about extension and outreach programs, essentially non-formal or community-based youth and adult education. But as you've seen, one could also evaluate organizations, personnel, products. There's all sorts of other types of things that could be evaluated, and the term evaluand is just an umbrella term that covers all of the different things that could be evaluated. Now, this is something I mentioned just briefly when I was talking about meta-evaluation, and it's this notion, fairly important, that when we think about the different roles that a professional evaluator might take on, one big important distinction is whether that person is an internal evaluator or an external evaluator. And it is basically what it sounds, but an internal evaluator would work directly for the organization or the company or the program which is being evaluated. So you might have 3 people charged with program implementation and then 1 person charged with evaluating the program. And they tend to work very closely with the program. So there are the pros and cons of having an internal evaluator. And then very often an organization will use an external evaluator. So it's someone who is a professional evaluator brought in from the outside and hired for a short time, usually on a contractual or a consultancy basis, to do that evaluation. So again, there are pros and cons of that, which some of you have already been engaging with through the various activities you've written. Then I think one interesting point that came out of the readings that were due for this week is this distinction and potentially tension between micro-level evaluation and macro-level. How there might be some purposes which are appropriate for an evaluation at a very large country-wide scale or state-wide scale, but those purposes might not dovetail well with purposes which might be expressed for an evaluation at a micro level, for instance at a county level or even very, very small community level. So just this is basically an idea that I wanted to throw out there now and have us be aware of when we're talking about the different purposes and the different approaches, to keep in mind that from a systems perspective, it really matters how much you zoom in or zoom out. Are you focusing on a very micro scale, or are we talking about a policy or program which might be affecting the entire United States? And then I don't want to go into this too much, but just to point out that today's readings, the readings that are due for this week, did mention just quickly a brief history of evaluation. It's on page 22 of the Mertens and Wilson textbook. And I think just this might add on to all of the various other readings for last week that kind of articulate how evaluation is this profession. And the history of the profession is something which might be important to think about, especially those first, second, third, and fourth generation or wave of evaluation, and also many of us rely on governmental funding to support the extension and outreach programming that we do. And it's really important to realize that basically the profession of evaluation really came to be once the U.S. government in particular began emphasizing accountability and inquiry to try to learn about the programs that they were funding. So just a few ideas to keep in mind as we move forward. Now, as you've probably been able to ascertain from the readings, we are taking a bit of a dive into some very theoretical concepts, which is why I'm talking through some of them in this presentation. But to start with, especially if you found some of the readings to be challenging, and of course that's just an assumption that I'm making, one thing to keep in mind, and that hopefully we can work together with, is this idea that there is nothing as practical as a good theory. And of course what this means is these terms, even if it seems like jargon, hopefully are not completely useless, but the reason that we're focusing on them is because they can actually connect to your practice as an educator or as an agent of change in your community, whatever it is that you do. So that we're not doing this just to talk about academic words. We're doing this because it is highly practical. And hopefully this is something that you'll see as we go through. And in fact, the activity that will be presented as part of this module is directly connected to that. To help you begin, it's just a beginning, but to help you begin to articulate your own theoretical and philosophical stance vis-a-vis evaluation, drawing specifically from your practical experiences as an educator. So as you saw in the readings, what we're focusing on this week are the roots and the branches of evaluation and all of the paradigms and assumptions that go with that. And one thing that you might have realized is even though the tree metaphor can be really good, it has some limitations because the branches of a tree don't necessarily connect. Once you've made one decision to climb out on one branch, you're kind of out on that branch. You're out on a limb in a sense, and you're not out on another branch. So the tree metaphor might not be the best metaphor. So one thing that was proposed in the textbook, and also perhaps in your own thinking as well, was maybe a river is a better metaphor. So this is actually a satellite picture of a river somewhere in South America, which I think is a better metaphor for showing how the different streams of thought, the different ideas, come together, flow together, might branch off, and then branch back together. It's kind of the complex ecosystem of a river within a landscape, which to me presents a good metaphor for how these roots and branches really interact. So you might find in your own work that you do subscribe to a particular paradigm, but that in other situations or other contexts, you also draw from other paradigms and other traditions of evaluation. And I think that's completely okay. And that's what the Alkin and Christie reading really brings to the fore for me. So just really quickly here, I wanted to touch on a few concepts. One is the role of theory in evaluation, and then another will be the major branches and the paradigms that are associated with those branches, and also relatedly the different philosophical assumptions that go into those paradigms. But to start with, many of you might be familiar with different social scientific theories. Now these would be things like social ecological development theory from Urie Bronfenbrenner, or feminist theory, or various theories of leadership. Now those are all completely outside of evaluation, but they have bearing on evaluation. We bring them in, and those influence our models and our approaches. And the second one is over on the left, this notion of program theory, which you explicitly or implicitly are familiar with if you've ever done any work with a logic model. Because basically a logic model is a way of articulating the theory of change within a program. It's program theory. So that is basically the causal assumptions that go together to lay out why, in a series of if-then statements, why certain activities are hypothesized to lead to certain outcomes and impacts. Then the hardest one to understand at this point is the middle part, which is evaluation theory. And I don't want to dwell on it except to say that, as you may have noticed in the textbook, there's a evaluation scholar named Will Shadish, who wrote that really you could be the best social scientist imaginable. You could be a really good facilitator as well. You could have a lot of those competencies, but if you don't ground your work in evaluation-specific theories, which we'll be delving into over the next couple of weeks, then you are not truly an evaluator. So it's just an interesting addition to the sort of list of competencies and of different hats that one has to wear if one is going to be an evaluator. So now, bear with me as we dive into some of the different philosophical assumptions that make up a given paradigm. So part of the task before us is to understand these different paradigms which influence evaluation, and then to try to see ourselves in one or the other one of these paradigms, these evaluation paradigms, based on where we land on these different assumptions. So, again, a lot of jargon, but hopefully we'll see that it can be practical and applicable once we try to understand what's really going on here. The first one that Mertens and Wilson lay out is axiology. And very briefly, that just means the study of ethics and values. So it can ask questions like, what is the nature of ethics and values in an evaluation? So it's very closely related to ethics, but it itself is not ethics. Axiology would be some purposeful engagement with questions around ethics, like what is ethical in one context? Are ethics universal in certain senses? If something is right in one context, is it then right everywhere around the world with every culture? Questions like that are axiological questions, and there are a number of examples we'll see as far as how that pertains to evaluation. Secondly, there's the notion of ontology, which has to do with questions around what is the nature of reality. And this sounds kind of pie in the sky, abstract, but really, different evaluators approach a given evaluand in a given context with different paradigmatic assumptions based on fundamentally what they understand to be the nature of reality. So one example of this might be how we deal with even the idea of good education, right? So one evaluator who has one perspective or one version of reality in which good education is something that has been produced by a scientist and has gone through some rigorous scientific study. For them, ontologically speaking, that is really good education. But for someone else, maybe someone in an indigenous community or someone at a local level, they might respect science and see that as important, but for them, ontologically speaking, what constitutes good education could be something that is related to what the community elders have been doing for years and years and years. So there you have two ontologically different realities, essentially, of what constitutes good education. A similar example might be how we deal with big categories like racial categories or even gender. These days, many theoretical approaches, have seen that, for instance, race is generally actually a social construct, not some biological construct. However, there are different researchers and different evaluators, some of whom might still be approaching race ontologically as some sort of biological a priori construct, and others who see it as socially constructed within a given context. So again, different versions of essentially the same reality. And these are ontological questions which matter for how we do evaluation. Very closely related to that is the notion of epistemology. So epistemology has to do with the nature of knowledge. Now that we've talked a little bit about ontology, how can we know about that world that is out there? So just to give an example, and actually this goes all the way back to John Dewey, who was one of the first scholars of education here in the United States, writing about education back in the early 1900s. And he talked about the spectator view of knowledge, and he was against that idea. Now, by spectator view of knowledge, he meant that so often researchers would go into a school or go into a community, and they would just observe and try to be a non-participant observer, just like we saw in one of those ethical challenge scenarios that we worked through this week. And the idea behind that epistemology, or the spectator view of knowledge epistemology, was that knowledge of the world is seen as a sort of true representation, almost a one-to-one relationship, like not even like in a mirror, because as you know, in a mirror, you're actually seeing the mirror image or the flipped image of what is out there in reality. But it's a similar thing in that you in a representational type of epistemology, it's one example of an epistemology, the theory of knowledge or the philosophy of knowledge would say that your knowledge of the world is a true representation of that reality out there. Now, other folks would have more of a transactional type of epistemology. And now this would be a different belief or a different assumption in which you would say knowledge of the world is not a true representation of some static out there reality, but rather it is knowledge of the world in function of our efforts to know it. So that anything you do to try to create knowledge or to know about the world is actually an intervention. You're inevitably changing the world as you try to know it. And because of that, your knowledge is not just objective, static knowledge of the world. Your knowledge is knowledge of the world in function of your effort to know it. And in fact, some of the folks who know this epistemology the best are actually modern physicists who, in working with, for instance, the uncertainty principle of Heisenberg, not Heisenberg of Breaking Bad, if you've happened to see that show, but the original Heisenberg. Heisenberg actually said, our knowledge of the world is not knowledge of the world, but rather knowledge of the world subjected to our mode of questioning. So how that pertains to evaluation is you could have the same question or phenomenon out there in the world, right? My 4-H program or my educational endeavors that my business are doing. That is a reality that's out there. But depending on your epistemology, you might come up with different data collection approaches, and that gets us to the next point, which is methodology. Based on your understanding of what constitutes knowledge of that reality, of your program, you're going to come up with different instrumentation, different systematic approaches to gathering information. And in doing so, you might choose a quasi-experimental design, a very science-driven approach, getting back to Trosham's different definitions of the purposes or the approaches within evaluation. Or you might choose a very constructivist-oriented participant observation or action research, because for you, in a more transactional epistemology, you know that just by being in the room, you're going to be influencing what goes on. So you might as well use that productively and really engage with your participants and focus on meaning making rather than on some objective reality. So you see in that little example, ontology, epistemology, and methodology were all interwoven. And I think that connects also to ethical questions and values. Your philosophical assumptions about reality, knowledge, and data collection are all fundamentally tied into your notion of what is ethical, what is right, what is valuable. And then one last one to throw in just for good measure is quite connected to ontology, but there's an educational theorist whose work I really appreciate. His name is Gert Bista, and I will post an article by him in the resources section in just an additional resources folder, which are not required. But if you're really interested in these philosophical assumptions, Bista has a really good paper that looks into them, specifically in relation to this whole evidence-based education movement and the gold standard and these debates about what is the best way to know about good education. But he includes this other dimension, which is praxeology, and that focuses on the nature of human action. And if you think back to program theory and logic models and the assumptions that go into a logic model, really, every logic model and everything you do in your program, in your professional practice, you are, whether you know it or not, buying into one particular theory or one set of theories about human behavior chains, human agency, how humans work in the world, what makes you change your thinking or your actions around a given thing. How do we get people to wear their seatbelts more, or to stop texting while they drive, or to stop smoking, or something like that? People have different theories of behavior change around those societal issues, and they bring them to bear through the programs, the extension and outreach programs that they bring to the table. So it's related to people's theories of reality, but it's a little bit drilled down, and it focuses specifically on people's theory of behavior change. So now that brings us to these common paradigms in evaluation, which here we're using again the metaphor of the tree with the four major branches of the methods branch, the use branch, the values branch, and the social justice branch, all of which come from the same taproot of accountability, fiscal management, and social inquiry. Now I have to say right off the bat that for me, these branches do blend together, much like the water in a river system. The two that blend together the most would be values and social justice, because sometimes I have a hard time sort of seeing, okay, if we're talking about values, aren't we also talking about social justice? But I see that there is a difference there, but that's just an example of how these can kind of bleed together. So, based on the different philosophical assumptions that we've just gone over, things to do with epistemology, ontology, methodology, etc., there are four common paradigms in evaluation. And these paradigms tend to be associated with the four different branches. So one common paradigm is actually quite common in evaluation and in a lot of research, a lot of scientific research, and that is the post-positivist paradigm. And it is most closely associated with the methods branch, and they would focus on really rigorous experimental designs or quasi-experimental designs. Now these are things we can go into in greater detail later, but just for now to get it out there that probably the most common paradigm in research and in some aspects of evaluation would be the post-positivist, which has a particular epistemology, probably more of that objectivist epistemology. Empiricism would be another definition of the post-positivist epistemology, where knowledge of the world is really seen as this representation of what's out there, and it's all based on sensory experience. So this would be, if you can't touch it or feel it, then it doesn't really exist. So someone talking about their feelings or the meaning that they might make about your program, their interpretations of your program, would not be as focused on within a post-positivist paradigm. The second paradigm, which is quite common, is the pragmatist paradigm. And this is associated often with the use branch. And it's, as you were able to read about and will be able to read about in the next couple of weeks, this is kind of a paradigm that is kind of like a handyman's approach. So, you've got a problem in front of you, do whatever works, do whatever is going to be useful. So they might pull from mixed methods, they might pull from different social theories, and patch it all together to come up with an approach that really works in a given context. That's kind of the pragmatist approach to evaluation. Then the third is what I was just kind of getting at with talking about what the post-positivist paradigm is not, and that is a focus on values and on meaning making and on sort of the way in which social realities are socially constructed. So the example of race and studying race, doing an evaluation on a program that, say, has a race component or a gender component, that would be something that a constructivist paradigm might be well suited for working with, because it's really about how it takes an epistemology and puts it into play where knowledge of the world is really a function of the social processes that go into it, and here values and social betterment definitely play a role. Continuing on, and again, this might be an area that would be appropriate also for focusing, say, on a program that was concerned with social justice and trying to use evaluation and social programs to undo some of the injustices that have been done throughout our society, and to really, in every aspect of the evaluation, from the selection of the evaluation questions to the selection of data collection approaches, to how you engage with stakeholders, to even what the overarching purposes are for the evaluation. Accountability might be one purpose here, but transformative and emancipatory and anti-racist, anti-sexist, etc. goals would also be part of this type of evaluation, no matter what the evaluation is of. It might be an agricultural project, it might be an after-school program. Whatever the program is, or the evaluand, to use that term, the transformative paradigm is going to inevitably have an emphasis on social justice, on equity, and on equality. Now, we're almost done for this module, but just before we wrap up, another aspect that the readings touched on was the multiple roles that an evaluator can play. There's a really nice chart in the textbook that talks about those various roles. For instance, the evaluator as detective, as facilitator, etc. And in this table, this figure that I have up here, it's actually looking at how the different branches on the evaluation tree tend to emphasize, how these different paradigms really emphasize the different roles of the evaluator to a greater or lesser extent. So you see here that from the methods paradigm, the post-positivist paradigm, the role of the evaluator is as an objective and neutral party. So there are certain implications that come along with that. From the use branch, which is more of the constructivist paradigm, the role of the evaluator is to really be a mediator and a manager with everyone involved in that program, with the end goal of having the evaluation actually not just have utility, but actually be used. From the values branch, the emphasis tends to be more on the values branch, which is the constructivist. The use branch is more closely associated with the pragmatist. Although, again, the reason why I mention that is actually because the use branch is equally, I think, pragmatist and constructivist at the same time. Regardless, in the values branch, the role of the evaluator would really be as a communicator, trying to come up with the best possible dialogue, the most free and democratic and open dialogue where these values can be surfaced. And then finally, the social justice evaluator from the transformative paradigm, which, by the way, is the one which your textbook author is kind of the founder of and one of the most influential actors in, Donna Mertens. So she subscribes to the transformative emancipatory paradigm and the social justice branch of evaluation. And there you're a little bit like a community organizer or a relationship builder who is enough in the context, enough in the program or the organization to build up trust and respect and to have a legitimate say about the different structural inequalities that might be at play there. So that brings us to the end of this module. Again, there's a lot there, but hopefully through the forum discussion, which you're about to start, and also through the activity, which focuses on the first effort that I want you to take to try to articulate, and some of you have already done it, to be sure, in your reading responses. Almost inevitably, you start trying to see how these theories and paradigms and philosophical assumptions, how they connect to your professional practice. And our activity today for this week rather, will let you do that in a little bit more intentionally even. But so for the forum this week, we'll have a series of questions which are posted now in the forum section. Again, you can choose 2 of them and answer them either as an attachment or as in text into the text box on the forum section. Really, I can't commend you all enough for your forum discussion from this past week. Really, really excellent ideas, excellent exchange among classmates. I'm very, very happy to see that, and I encourage you to keep that up as we go. So there are these 5 questions, and actually for a total of 10, I believe. Yes, 10 questions. You can just pick 2 and answer them to the best of your ability. Pick any 2 that you're interested in. And then once your peers have also gone in and put their discussion posts up, if you could just respond to 1 of theirs. So 2 original posts and at least 1 response. Some of you have been doing well more than 1 response, and I think that's excellent because that shows that you're really engaging with each other. Then the activity, which these instructions will be posted to the assignment section as well. But basically, there was this nonprofit organization called This I Believe, which was actually based on a 1950s radio program by the journalist Edward R. Murrow, and basically very influential members of American society, as well as just basic everyday people, would give these very brief essays and record them on the radio, talking about their essential beliefs, their worldviews, their fundamental paradigms. And it would be things like hard work or caring for your neighbors or creativity or something like that. This approach to sort of thinking through fundamental beliefs was brought back by a radio producer in recent years and actually turned into a series of books, and also a podcast series that is played on the radio. And there's the citation for the website down on the bottom right if you're interested in this. For us, for this activity, I want you to do a similar thing, but focusing on your own evaluation paradigm. Now, I know you might not think of yourself as an evaluator. It's just part of what you do or part of what you want to learn more about. And also, these terms and these paradigms might be very new to you. So this is just the first pass, the first try, a rough draft of thinking about your own evaluation paradigm. So don't worry about, I don't know what my paradigm is, or I don't even understand what you're talking about with paradigms. This is an activity that can hopefully help you get through some of that. So again, I'll post these instructions to the assignment section, but the instructions are basically this. You choose 1 or maybe 2 related branches or paradigms, and you claim them as, say, this is the one that I am subscribing to for now. And then you situate that choice by telling a story about your life or your work and why you see evaluation in this way. How did you come up with this evaluation paradigm? How was it formed in your own life as a critically reflective practitioner of extension and outreach programs? How has it been tested over the years? How is it being tested now? So this statement should be brief, just 1 or 2 pages, and try to emphasize the positive. So instead of saying what you don't believe in, really focus on within program evaluation and education in general. What do you believe, not what you don't believe, and speak in the first person, and then just try to make it conversational. This is not an academic exercise, even though it might be about these philosophical assumptions, these paradigms, which seem very academic. But the goal of this is to drive it home, to make it connect to your lived experiences as a practitioner in whatever educational endeavor you're involved in. So I believe that brings us to the end of this module. I really look forward to reading your forum posts on these questions and on reading your personal evaluation paradigm, this I believe statements. I thank you for all your great work and encourage you to keep it up.